Hello everyone. What we're going to look at today is we are going to look at an introduction to confidence intervals. Okay? Now, first thing you might be wondering is what on earth is a confidence interval? So, that's the first thing we're going to look. So, a confidence interval, what this does is this gives an approximate interval in which the population proportion which we denote as P is likely to fall. So basically it's an interval which we are hoping will capture this population proportion. Because as we've talked about before, when you are trying to come up with data about a population, it's often very hard because it's not very likely that you will often get a chance to survey an entire population. Okay, so really, we typically don't know what the actual population proportion is. Now, we can find a sample proportion, and a sample proportion is, that's what we often see, and that's no big deal because we're finding that proportion which is taken just from our sample, which we have the data for. But the population, we don't typically have that data. Now, one thing to note for a confidence interval, we typically will look at a 95% confidence interval. That is typically what you're going to be asked to calculate. And basically what this means, we can say then, we can make a statement, we are 95% confident that the true value of P is contained within this interval. Okay, so that's what that tells us. When we calculate a 95% confidence interval, that tells us we are 95% confident in saying that the true value of P, the true population proportion, is contained somewhere within this interval. So what we're going to look at is we are going to look at an example where we actually calculate a 95% confidence interval. So for our example, I'm just going to give you kind of some rundown of the information that we have. We have 156 people aged 18 through 22, and they were surveyed. All right. Now, of these people, it was reported that 48 update their Facebook daily. So 48 of this 156 people update their Facebook status daily. Now, this is just a sample. We surveyed only 156 people aged 18 through 22. So do we know that, or can we use this to determine what proportion of all 18 through 22-year-olds update their status daily? And that answer is no. So we can't actually calculate the true value of P, but what we can do is we can calculate P hat, which is our population, or I'm sorry, our sample proportion. So just by doing 48 out of 156, I get 0.3076. Okay, so approximately 30.8% of our sample updated their Facebook status daily. Now, we want to know, based on this information, we want to find a 95% confidence interval for our actual value of P, okay? So, we know P hat, and that's good to know, but that doesn't give us P, so we're going to use this, though, to try to come up with an interval which we feel pretty confident that the true value of P, the true population proportion actually falls in. So to do this, what we need is we need to come up with an estimate for the standard deviation. We don't know the standard deviation for anything, for our population, for our sample. We don't know any of it. So we're going to try to come up with an estimate for our sample, for our standard deviation. And what we refer to this estimate as, so let's see, estimate of standard deviation, we refer to as the standard error. Now, this standard error we denote as SE, and we are finding that standard error of p hat, okay? So we are estimating the standard deviation for our sample. And we have a formula for this. SE of p hat is equal to the square root of p hat times 1 minus p hat over n. Now, if you take what we already know and plug this in, we're going to have and I'm just going to round it to 0.308 times 1 minus 0.308, because 308, remember from up here, was our p hat. And we're going to divide that by n, which is our number that we surveyed, so 156. So what we're going to come up with for our standard error is 0.037, or approximately 3.7%. Okay, so that's our standard error. Now, to calculate a 95% confidence interval, this is based on our standard deviations. If you think about what our normal curve looks like, okay, we've got our center, well, in this case, it wouldn't be mu. Our center would be where p hat is. Okay. Man, can't write today. Let's try that one more time. P hat. There we go. And then we are going to move 1, 2, 3 standard deviations either way. And just from previous lessons, we should know what percent of our sample is contained between each of these standard deviations. And if we move 2 standard deviations to each side, that's going to be 95%. Okay, so to get 95% of our data within this curve, this area right here is what represents 95% of our data. So we are 95% confident that the true value of p falls somewhere in this region. Now, to actually come up with that area, we have to do a lower limit and an upper limit. So we're going to do our p hat value minus 2 of our standard deviations. So our standard deviation or our estimate for our standard deviation that we found was 3.7. Then we have to do p hat plus 2 of our standard deviations. And this is going to give us the value for right here and here. So that's going to tell us the 2 values that we're confident that p is going to fall in between. So when I do those calculations, and again using p hat, remember we found in the beginning, we found that to be 30.8%. So when I do these calculations, I get 23.4 and 38.2. So what we're saying with this, we are 95% confident that the value of p is contained in the interval from 23.4 to 38.2%. So we believe the true value of P, we believe that somewhere between 23.4 and 38.2% of all 18 to 20-year-olds, 22-year-olds actually update their status every day. And like I said, we don't know that. We know from our sample that 30.8% did. So all we can do then is come up with our best estimate on what the actual p-value is going to be. And all we can do there is come up with an interval and say, we're pretty sure that it's going to fall between this interval. We are 95% sure. Okay, so now we want to look at calculating a confidence interval on the calculator. Okay, so we want to calculate this on our calculator. So let me get my calculator up. Clear this out. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to go to Stat. We're going to go over to Test. And we are doing a 1 prop z interval. 1 prop z interval, not the 1 prop z test. There it is, 1 prop z interval. Now, when we look at this, all it asks for is x, and that's the number that our sample showed. So from our sample, if you think back to our example, we showed that 48 out of a total of 156 who were surveyed update their Facebook status daily. Then it's going to ask you, what do you want your confidence level to be? We want to calculate a 95% confidence interval. So when we go to calculate, it's going to come up with our interval, which 23.5 to 38.0. Let's see, compared to what we got, which was 23.4 to 38.2, we're pretty darn close. So considering we would have rounded some, the calculator would not, we're pretty close. So that is calculating your confidence interval using both formula by hand and also using the calculator.